So let's talk about how to determine reliable, credible authorities. In another lesson, I talked about how to evaluate reliable, credible literature. So when you're trying to read a book, a newspaper, watching something on the news, how do you decide whether or not the information you're getting is reliable, credible, worth your time? So how do we do that with authorities? Now, authority is somebody who's supposed to have access to certain facts, who has special qualifications for drawing conclusions for facts. So the overwhelming majority of the things that we believe is based on the authority of others. We defer to authorities for most of the things we believe, right? So you don't believe that there are such a thing as atoms and electrons because you have done the experimentation, you have done the observation. You believe that there are things like matter, atoms, and electrons because that's what the science books tell us. So the people who write the science books, or the scientists themselves, the researchers, those are the authorities. And what they say we believe because they have access to the facts and they're able to interpret the right evidence. You believe certain things about God, that there is a God or there is no God. You believe certain things about politics and nutrition and the legal system on the basis of authorities, people outside yourself who are supposed to have access to the facts and who are supposed to have the qualifications to interpret the facts and give us information about them. The overwhelming majority of things we believe is based on the authority of others, and that's totally normal. So when we defer to authorities, when we say stuff like, well, current research shows, or Professor so-and-so said, or this textbook said, that's a perfectly legitimate way to make your case, to argue for something, to prove that something is or is not true according to what you believe. It's totally normal. And it's actually necessary because we don't have all of the time in the world. Even if you're in prison and you have a lot more time than a free world person, we don't have all the time in the world to study everything there is in existence. The information contained in, I think it's the information contained in like one newspaper from today or one volume of an encyclopedia is more information than people in the Middle Ages would have ever known throughout their entire life. And we can know that information in one day. There's no way that we could keep up with all of the new information that's being discovered in the world. We also don't have enough money. We don't have enough resources, or we don't have enough intellect to even understand all of that information. It's necessary that we depend on some things we believe about the world on the basis of authorities. So the question is, how do we decide who is and is not a credible, reliable, legitimate authority? And that's what I want to talk about. This is a part of a larger discussion concerning evidence. When we believe something or we're trying to argue for something or persuade someone to believe something, we do that on the basis of evidence. And one kind of evidence is belief on the basis of authority, when we defer to the experts, to the researchers, or to the authorities to support the things that we believe and say. So here's some examples of deferring to an authority. When I say something like, the American Medical Association says blah, 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 or current neuroscience says this, I'm deferring to experts in the realm of medicine, neuroscience, and biology. If I said the president of the American Psychological Association believes that we can develop our potentials to live quality lives, I'm deferring to the authority of the president of the American Psychological Association. When you hear on the news that research shows or studies show, we're deferring to researchers and scientists. If you defer to your grandpa or something and say, well, my dad or my grandpa was in Vietnam, so he knows, he experienced whatever. If you refer to the Quran or the Bible or the Vedas of Hinduism, then you're deferring to a religious authority. The Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, those are your authority in understanding how to live your life and understand the spiritual world. When you refer to a magazine or a book or a college professor, or, Brandon said, Dr. Warren said this, that, or the other, you're deferring to an authority. Or maybe you actually observed something, right? You were like, I know this is true because I was there. I saw it with my own eyes, right? Or I know what prison is like because I have lived experience. I've been there. So we defer to authorities all the time. It might be relatives, teachers, books, researchers, or it might even be ourselves. We might claim that we are authorities because we have the right credentials or the right experience. The key point is some authorities should be taken more seriously than others. They should be taken more seriously than others because they have better credentials or they are more careful in explaining their opinions to other people. They're more careful in drawing conclusions or giving their opinions to others. Everybody knows someone who talks all the time and believes they know something about everything. They're quick to judge, they're quick to give their opinion, and sometimes they have to backpedal because they just say stuff out of impulse and it's ridiculous. And then other people are slower to speak. And maybe they have more informed decisions or informed information about a given subject. We might see one as impulsive and foolish and one as wise. In any case, there are levels of authority, and some authorities should be taken more seriously than others. So if any of you remember the National Enquirer, it was, so like if you were ever in Walmart or something and you were in the grocery line and there'd be a bunch of magazines and there'd be one called the National Enquirer, which said crazy stuff like evidence for werewolves or alien life or something like that. And then right next to it would be something like Newsweek or Time Magazine. All of them are magazines, right? But Newsweek and Time Magazine would be more credible, reliable sources than the National Enquirer. And why is that, right? If you were to say, well, I read in a textbook that prison is like this. If you were to read an article about some mental disorder like schizophrenia or bipolar, and you read it from a scientific journal or publication, that would have more authority, be more reliable source of information than just your cellie's opinion on it, unless your cellie happens to be like a PhD psychologist, right? Very unlikely. Maybe your relatives' opinions on something is not as valuable as, a textbook's opinion on it, unless, of course, maybe your relatives are, in fact, authorities in the subject. So how do we decide who's a credible, reliable, legitimate authority? So here's a few guidelines for deciding reliable authorities. Number one, and this might just be obvious, it might be common sense, but there must be some sort of evidence that one is actually an authority before their testimony can be trusted. Right? So like if we're in a court and the district attorney has somebody up on the witness stand, they'll ask their name or whatever. But if it's something like a psychologist or a professional, like somebody who reads DNA, they'll ask them, what are your credentials? And then they have to repeat back, well, I have this degree at this university. I have this many years of experience, blah, blah, blah. Right? That's basic. If you're going to refer to some authority to prove your point or make your case, then there has to be evidence that this is in fact a legitimate authority. That ought to be obvious. But think about it for a minute. Of all the various things you believe in the world, whether it's about nutrition or the weather, do you believe those things because the person who told you or the source from which you got the information is actually an authority in that subject? So for example, do I know what I'm talking about? I'm making all these videos to help you all understand critical thinking and education and a little bit about philosophy or whatever. So am I an authority? Is there any evidence that I actually have some credibility or reliability? Am I a trustworthy source for these things? What is my background, right? Well, there's different ways that you can assess somebody's level of expertise or their criteria. So one is their academic credentials. Does a person have a degree in the field where they're making proclamations, right? So I'm talking about critical thinking, philosophy, a little bit of psychology. So what kind of academic credentials do I have? I have an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, 2 master's degrees, and a doctorate degree. So I have some quality educational background. But what are those degrees in? I'm talking about critical thinking with you all. If I have a doctorate degree in biology or a doctorate degree in Russian history, does that qualify me to make lessons on critical thinking? Maybe. You have to ask some more questions, but a basic question you want to ask is, what are the academic credentials of a given person? When you're thinking about those credentials, it could be what kind of degree do they have? A bachelor's, a master's, a PhD, or a doctorate of education? What school did it come from? Is it a legitimate school? Because as I've mentioned in a previous lesson, there are a lot of schools that claim to be accredited and they get people in prison to pay all kinds of money to get these degrees. And those schools are not accredited. So if you say you have a doctorate from this correspondence course that you were involved in, and I can't say no names, I don't want to get in trouble, but if you say that in a room full of people who have doctorate degrees from, say, Texas A&M University or University of North Texas, they're gonna laugh at you, Or they might withhold their laugh and they just may look at you like, well, you don't really understand what you're saying if you think that that school is a legitimate school. Some schools are better than others. You recognize that, like in sports, there's going to be universities that are recognized for their athletic department, for their football team, their basketball team, and some are not. So some are more qualified than others in terms of the academic degrees that they bestow on people. So somebody with a degree from Harvard is going to have more academic standing than somebody with a degree from, say, just a community college. So what kind of degree do they have? What is the subject matter of their degree? Do they have a degree in law, science, whatever? And what school did they get that degree from? Is it a legitimate accredited school? I'm going to make a separate lesson on accreditation where I kind of explain what it means to be accredited, because I really want to help people, dealing with all these correspondence courses in schools. They have questions about their accreditation and whether it's worth spending your money on. But you want to make sure that the school that they have a degree from is accredited. So what else can you ask? What if they don't have a degree or you don't know what degree it's in, what school they came from? Well, do they have any experience in the subject in which they're speaking? Now, this is an important one, but it can also be tricky. There's a term right now called lived experience. It's very popular among people. People believe that if you have lived experience in a certain area, then you have a certain level of authority to speak on the situation, right? So I've been to prison, so I have some lived experience about what it means to be in prison. So if I'm sitting next to somebody who's never been to prison and the two of us are discussing what it's like, then according to the standard of experience, it would seem that I have more reliability, I have more legitimacy in discussing what prison is like because I actually spent several years there than the person who didn't. However, this is not always the case, right? Because many of y'all know some people can be in prison for a long time. They're just not critical thinkers. They're not reflective thinkers. They're not deep thinkers. And so if somebody were to ask them, what is prison like? What is the environment like? What are the politics like? Even though they've been there for a long time, they may just not have the kind of mindset or communicative skills to explain what it's really like. So just because you have experience in an area doesn't mean that you're an authority in the area, but it does give you a lot more credibility. We can also determine, well, what kind of experience does a person have, right? So I spent several years in prison, but I didn't spend a decade or 2 or 3 decades, and I never went to SEG. Right, I was in isolation for like a couple of weeks, but some people have been in isolation for years on end. So even though I have lived experience of prison, I might be sitting next to somebody who's been down a lot longer than I did in different situations. And so they have more credibility than I do in that area, right? So it's the same thing if somebody's been to war, like an active duty veteran versus somebody who never saw any active duty. So experience is a good thing. Right? It gives you credibility in a certain area that you're speaking, but there are different levels of experience, and having experience doesn't automatically qualify you as an authority in that area. In my job, my full-time role is to help people with reentry. So helping prepare people to get out of prison, and then once they get out, helping them with that transition. So I don't have a degree in reentry. I don't have a degree in criminal justice. I have experience in those areas because, number one, I've experienced it myself. I had to go through that whole process myself, and I've been helping people do that for many years. So I have experience, but I don't have a degree, right? Third major qualification is what kind of job or position do they hold? So I am the director of reentry services, and I've done this for 5 years, and I've actually worked inside the prison system for 11 or 12 years at this point. And I also serve time in prison. So my role as an employee is to help people with reentry. So even if I don't have a degree in reentry and I don't have any experience from being in prison, my job is to help people with reentry. So I have some sort of background or credibility in that area. So if a person works in a particular field or industry or subject, then that might give them some credibility, even if they don't have a degree, or in some cases, they may not have experience in that particular area. For example, there might be a counselor who helps veterans with post-traumatic stress syndrome, but that counselor has never themselves been to war. So they have a degree in psychology and they have a job that gives them credibility, but they haven't actually had that experience. So your job and your position might actually give you some credibility as well. Another one might just be your reputation. Do you have a reputation in this particular subject? So, what the authority that you're looking at, maybe they don't have a degree in science. Maybe they don't have a job as a scientist. Maybe they don't have enough experience in the area. But maybe they've written a lot of books and pamphlets on scientific material or on scientific issues, and other scientists read that literature and recognize them as a reliable source. That's possible as well. This can easily happen, like if somebody has a degree in history, someone with a degree in history, or in my case, someone with a degree in education. We can write and speak on a wide variety of subjects because history or education encompasses so much. Someone with a liberal arts degree could talk about a variety of issues. Someone with a philosophy degree could talk about a wide variety of issues. So people may have built up a reputation in a certain area that gives them more credibility than just having a degree or some experience in that area. And this is very similar to another one, which is their achievements. What kind of things have they achieved in that area? Someone's achievements are usually in line with their academic degrees or their job or their experience. So if someone has written a book in an area, then the book they wrote is probably something they're familiar with because of their job, their experience, or their academic degree, but not all the time. So for example, business owners, entrepreneurs. An entrepreneur could start a business that becomes very successful. And that business might be in selling sports goods, sports equipment. That doesn't mean they have any background at all in software and information technology, but they have background in starting a business and running a successful business. So that might be able to translate into starting a business in software and information technology, or starting a travel agency, or starting a restaurant. So they've achieved success in the area of business or entrepreneurship, and that might translate into success in other areas, even if they don't have a degree or background in it. So academic credentials, what kind of degrees do they have? What kind of licenses, certifications do they have? And were the places that awarded them these degrees, licenses, and certifications, were they legitimate schools, legitimate places of business? What kind of experience does the person have? Do they have some sort of lived experience? They have personal experience from having been through different things. What kind of job or position do they have in society? What reputation have they established for themselves over the years? And what have they achieved in their life in that area? So those are different things that you can look to decide whether or not someone is a credible authority. So I started off by saying that if you're going to defer to an authority to make your case, to support things that you say or believe, there has to be some sort of evidence that that person or that book is actually an authority. One way you determine that is looking at things like their academic credentials, their job, their reputation, experience, or whatever. And the reason those things, reputation, job, experience, and academic credentials, the reason those things lend someone to becoming an authority is because those things put people in a position to have access to facts, evidence, and information, and they know how to interpret them rightly. Legitimate authorities can be trusted because they have evidence and they know how to interpret that evidence, right? So your doctor, you would trust your doctor because not only do they see the symptoms that you have, but they are able to interpret those symptoms. So for example, if you go to the doctor, you tell the doctor what your symptoms are. You think you're sick because you have all these different kinds of symptoms, but the doctor is understanding what you're saying, and then they know how to interpret the combination of those symptoms, and they'll say something like, well, you probably have just a cold, or maybe you have something like the flu or pneumonia. So they have the same evidence you do because you're telling them what your symptoms are, but they know how to rightly interpret it. Lawyers understand how to interpret whatever evidence and testimony you've provided them, or they're able to gather from someone else. So not only do they have access to evidence and facts and information, but they have the understanding to interpret it rightly. So if you're looking at something and they don't fit the academic credentials, reputation, experience, job, achievements, then it's questionable whether they have any authority to speak on that subject. So authorities outside of their field don't actually have any authority. So for example, if somebody has a PhD, like for example, Stephen Hawking, right? Stephen Hawking, one of the most brilliant minds to ever live, and he's a scientist, quantum physics. He actually made some statements about philosophy one time. He basically said that science will replace the need for philosophy. We won't need philosophers or philosophical idea or discussions anymore because scientific discovery will replace it. Now, if he is one of the most brilliant minds to have ever lived, he's a well-respected, world-renowned scientist, but he's making a claim about philosophy. Does he have authority to speak in the area of philosophy? Well, he might. There are other people who have, for example, a neurologist at Yale has both a PhD in science and a PhD in philosophy, but Stephen Hawking doesn't. And when Stephen Hawking made that claim about philosophy, he was making a philosophical claim himself. So while he's saying that philosophy will be irrelevant because scientific discovery will make it unnecessary, that in itself is a philosophical claim, a philosophical belief about what science does and what philosophy does. So in trying to refute philosophy, he's doing philosophy. He's making a philosophical claim. And a philosopher would have caught that immediately, and they did. So whereas Stephen Hawking is brilliant and we should listen to him when he talks about science and physics, that doesn't necessarily mean he knows anything about ancient medieval art or English poetry. He knows about science. So authorities outside of their area don't actually have authority. Beware of authorities who claim to know things that they can't actually know, right? Now, this one is kind of tricky because you may not know what people can and cannot know. Take, for example, a psychologist. A psychologist, or maybe somebody who works in law enforcement and does interrogations regularly. These people have deep insight into the way people think, their reasoning, their mental states, and their behavior. But that doesn't mean that they can actually read your mind. When a psychologist or someone says, I've seen this before, I know exactly what you're thinking. Or they observe something on TV or in the world and they say, oh, I know what they're thinking. I know why they did what they did. Well, maybe they do. It really depends on the circumstances. But just because you're a psychologist or you do interrogations for a living doesn't mean you actually know the state of mind someone is in. Doesn't actually mean that you can read minds or read hearts. So there are different degrees of reliability, different degrees of what we call probability, by which they can make claims about what people are thinking or why they do what they do, but they can't know it with certainty. So sometimes people make claims about things that can't be known, like predictions about the future. If you've ever watched the weather tries to make predictions about the future, and a meteorologist is someone that you should listen to when it comes to the weather, but they don't always get it right. And if they make predictions about the future like a year in advance, then you ought to know that's impossible, right? Most of the time, people are making predictions about the weather like 10 days in advance, and sometimes it's wrong. But for somebody to make a prediction a year or 2 years in advance, it doesn't matter what their academic credentials are, what their experience is. It's impossible for them to know that unless they're divine or something and they know the future. Unbiased, impartial authorities are better. So for example, this one is pretty obvious as well. Somebody who has something to gain or has something at stake, has something to lose in a given issue. Those people have a bias that might lead them to understand, interpret, and explain things wrongly. If someone stands to gain money, those people might not be the best authorities, the best witnesses, the best testimonies to listen to. That's why it's better to get somebody who is what they might call a third party, someone who is unrelated to the issue because they have a more objective position, a more objective perspective on a given issue. So like in a court of law, if you're on trial for something and you want to show that you're not crazy, you don't have any sort of mental disorders, and so you have your lawyer call up a psychologist to testify on your behalf. But then it turns out that the psychologist that you presented is your cousin, right? So your cousin now, they have authority, maybe they have degrees and a job and experience in the area of psychology. They can make a diagnosis of a mental disorder, but they're your cousin. So they have something to gain or lose depending on the outcome. And so that's not going to be allowed in a court of law. That's kind of obvious, right? That's why they have third parties. That's why they have people come in who are unrelated and have nothing to gain or lose from the situation to testify because they want an unbiased, impartial authority. If you're talking to somebody who's an authority on nutrition, right, and you want to understand a new diet plan that you can follow, maybe because you want to bulk up and get swole before you make parole, and you're talking to this person, and it just so happens that they run a business which sells diet products and supplements. So you're probably not going to get an unbiased, impartial answer from them. What they're going to tell you is something that will persuade you to possibly buy into their supplements and their diet plan because they have something to gain from it, right? So this sort of thing is obvious. When it comes to authorities, you want authorities who are as unbiased and impartial to the area as possible. But even if you've done your due diligence, you believe something, right? Like you believe, let's say, the vaccinations for COVID work, and you are referring to Dr. Fauci, and Dr. Fauci has a medical degree, so he is a credible authority in the area. He also has a job with the federal government, an important position which gives him authority in that area. And maybe he has a lot of experience in these areas. So he fits all the check boxes, right? He's got a reputation, he's got achievements, he's written books, won awards, whatever. But then you have somebody who is also someone with a PhD and experience, written books, and they disagree with Fauci about something related to COVID. So what do? This is something the whole world experienced in a real way throughout COVID. I mean, we're still sort of going through it, right? But when COVID first hit, everybody in the world then started to think about how do we determine who we should listen to? Because you have doctors with good credentials, good reputations, have achieved a lot in their area, and yet they disagree. And that's just a fact of life. It's a harsh truth that sometimes authorities, even the best of authorities, are going to disagree on a subject. And so then it puts the onus of responsibility back on you to make sure you know all of the evidence and how to interpret that evidence. So where authorities actually disagree, then it just puts the area back on you to try and figure out as best you can who you should believe. And there are some times in life when we just won't have a solid answer. We just won't have the kind of certainty that we're looking for. That's just how the world is. We don't always get knowledge that is absolutely stable, certain, and reliable. Sometimes we just have to take a risk. That means sometimes we could be wrong. And that leads us back to intellectual virtues, critical thinking dispositions, and mindsets. Sometimes in the world, we will just be wrong, and we need to own that and recognize its possibility. But when these authorities disagree, what do? Well, you cross-check them. You're doing your best to understand all the evidence and the facts. But then another thing you might do is look at the numbers. Do a lot of doctors in this area believe more on the lines of Fauci or the opposing position? Is it just a numbers game? Is it the case that maybe 90% of doctors around the world agree with Fauci and only 10% disagree? Then that might give you a little bit more understanding of maybe who you should go with. It doesn't mean that 90% of the doctors are going to be right. It could be these 10% over here. You don't know, but you're doing your best in making an informed decision about what to believe and who to believe. So the bottom line is we should believe the things we believe on the basis of good evidence and solid reasons. Sometimes our evidence is based on what authorities tell us, and all appeals to authority ultimately rest on the evidence possessed by the authority themselves. The only reason to quote them, the only reason to refer to them is because they have the evidence and they understand it better than we do. So there are some guidelines you can use to try and discern and understand better authorities. But at the end of the day, it could be the case that well-respected authorities disagree, and the responsibility falls back on you to make sure you're actually weighing the ideas and the facts in a reliable manner. Referring to an authority is only legitimate if that authority actually has more evidence and understands it better than you do.